One of the things that became very clear on my recent trip to Disneyland Paris is there are a lot of similarities with it and Walt Disney World, but there's also a lot of differences. I had an incredible time at Disneyland Paris and Walt Disney Studios and walking around Paris itself. There was so much to see and do. I couldn't help the whole time but look at it too through a perspective of somebody having worked at Walt Disney World as well, and noticing what was similar and what was different. And there were a lot of different things I noticed. One of the very first things, of course, is when you're there, is the languages. Working at Walt Disney World, being based in Florida, the predominant language is English. Yes, you get visitors from all around the world. You've got a lot of cast members that do speak other languages. But by far, the vast majority of what you hear is English. Every ride is in English, and every show is in English, and it's English everywhere. 85 to 90% of what you hear people speaking around the parks is going to be English. So you would think going to Disneyland in France, it would be about the same, right? Except it would all be French because you're outside of Paris. You would be wrong. I was surprised at how wrong that assumption was. It was amazing to hear how many different languages were being spoken constantly at the park. I mean, yes, there was obviously a lot of French, but I would say it was only about 30 to 40% French. And then there was almost as much English. In fact, several of the shows, such as Stitch Live or the Disney Preschool Live, those would actually alternate between English and French. Even on the Tower of Terror, they had French versions of the ride, but you could also ask and go on the English version of the ride. And I got to experience both. Several of the rides were bilingual, where they would go back and forth between English and French and English and French. For example, Ratatouille did that. So English was spoken almost as much as French was in the parks. There were still a ton of different languages that you were hearing constantly. A good example is when I was waiting to get on the Casey Jr. train, and the cast member that was there loading people on, I'm not exaggerating when I say in the space of about 8 families, he probably spoke 6 different languages, helping people get on the train. I was blown away by it. And yes, here in the States, we tend to be very one language-ish, and me even speaking Spanish is unusual for a lot of the US. But the idea of speaking 5, 6, 7 languages, to watch it in action was really, really cool. I was so impressed with how this was carried out throughout all of the parks. Even things like meeting the characters. The characters were all multilingual. We got to meet Aurora. She spoke French with the family before us and then English with us. My friends got to go visit with Spider-Man, and Spider-Man talked, whoa! And he spoke English with a little bit of a French accent, but he did speak. Even the ones that didn't talk out loud had no problem communicating with people who didn't speak French or English. They would just go back and forth fluidly and smoothly, and you could tell that there was very little comprehension problems. It was really, really neat to be able to sit back and watch that a lot of times. Another area that was similar and yet different was some of the silly and outright dumb things that you would watch some of the guests do. At both places, you would see guests do some things that weren't real smart and maybe not real safe. For example, sitting on fences, standing on fences. Disneyland Paris, they actually have the anvil where the Sword and the Stone used to be, and the sword is gone, but I would watch people that would actually stand on top of it to get their picture with the castle behind them. Even the playground over by the pirate ship had ways to climb and hang that you would never see at a US park anymore. Walt Disney World, if we saw things like that when we were working, we were instructed to gently ask the guests, hey, please hop off of that trash can, don't stand up there. Please don't hang off of the pole. Try to keep people from getting hurt, because if they fell and they got hurt in the States, they were probably going to sue Walt Disney World because they would blame Walt Disney World for not preventing them from being dumb. When they did it at Paris, I really didn't see the cast members enforcing them. They would just kind of let them do it. Just guessing. I think a lot of that does have to do with the lawsuit culture. Again, here in the US, if you're dumb and you get hurt because of your stupidity, you like to blame somebody else. In Europe, I almost got the impression that it was, hey, if you're dumb enough to do it and you get hurt, well, you know what? That's your own fault and your own problem. People also seem to be slightly more aware. For example, if they were standing on a bench, they were much more careful in some ways about how they were standing and what they were doing than what I would see at Walt Disney World, where people would be like on one foot on tiptoe, just waiting to try to fall. I don't know, maybe my interpretations there are off. They could be wrong. They might be slightly right, but it didn't seem as much of a concern in Paris as it did here in the States it would be. It did lead to one area, though, that I saw guests really pretty much ignore the rule, and it was just kind of a standard thing there, and that was on smoking. Technically, the Disney parks, both in the States and in Europe, are no smoking parks. You have designated smoking areas, and you're not really supposed to smoke outside of that. In the States, that's pretty much enforced. That didn't faze anybody in Europe. Nobody really concerned themselves about it. You would see people smoking right next to a no smoking sign. Trash cans that were marked no smoking had ashtrays in the top so people could smoke right at them. And you would see people smoking all over the place. It was just kind of accepted that people were going to smoke. In fact, you really didn't even hear it or see it mentioned in the parks, with a couple exceptions. Before the parade, they would have a big public announcement to please don't smoke except in designated areas. And then you would also see it during the fireworks. And I think the reason they announced it there was because people were much more compressed and standing on top of each other. It was interesting, though, because they even had whole brochures that were available at guest relations on keeping the air clean and please don't smoke in the parks and only use designated areas. So it was interesting to see how Disney said one thing, but when it came to enforcement, they really didn't. And that was due in a lot of ways to the culture and how the culture would interpret it. The same seemed very true about selfie sticks. They would make announcements before the parade and on shows, and they would say no selfie sticks allowed at all. You would still see people pop selfie sticks out in the middle of the park and take pictures, and cast members walk right past and not do or say anything. It seemed that as long as they weren't using the selfie stick in an area where they would hit other people or hit a ride or cause a problem, that they just kind of looked the other way. But during parades and fireworks and shows and on rides, well, it was definitely a big no-no then. That's assuming, of course, that you got your selfie stick past security, which is another area that is definitely different in Paris than it is in the States. In the States, if you go to a Disney park, you're going to have to go past a security checkpoint, and they're going to make you open up your bag and take a quick look inside of it. There are some spots now where we do have metal detectors, but it's just basically a quick peek and walk on through and you're done. Not in Paris. In Paris, you had, instead of a bag check that way, you had an x-ray machine that you would put your bag through and they would scan every single bag and inspect them. You had very high quality metal detectors. You had armed security at those spots. And they had military or police patrols with the full protective gear on. They look like they're ready to step into the middle of a firefight. They've got their guns strapped on, big automatic rifles, and they're walking around with their hands on the trigger, ready to use it at a moment's notice. In addition, they also had other armed policemen that had the guard dogs that were there. And these are dogs that were so friendly that they were actually fully muzzled, so they didn't have to worry about them biting somebody. And these guys are all out patrolling all over the place. Yeah, you could tell that Europe deals with a few security issues that we don't have here in the States. But once you got past the security points, well, then you were able to go into any of the parks or Disney Village, and you didn't have to go through security again. Unless, of course, you wanted to go to Five Guys, which for some weird reason was outside of the security perimeter at Disney Village. One other big rumor that you hear about here in the States is on the friendliness of people in France and at Disneyland and in Paris. The perception for people in the US is that French people tend to be kind of snobby and stuck up and on the rude side. I found it very interesting to find out that, generally speaking, I really didn't think that was very true at all. In fact, a couple of the rudest people I saw on the whole trip were Americans. Yeah. They might not be as outgoing in France as we are in the US, and I think that's part of the perceived difference. The French cast members would generally wait for you to come to them, but they were very friendly, and I met a lot of very friendly cast members. We had an incredible cast member on Tower of Terror that was so much fun and just a blast. And while her name in English is spelled Nicole, I was informed that her name is actually pronounced Nicola, and I hope I didn't mess that up for you. She was a lot of fun. I met several other cast members that were very entertaining and very fun to talk to and very helpful. We ran into one gentleman at Disneyland Paris that was extremely helpful over at Pirates And then the next day I saw him again, and he pointed me to a great place for the parade and a couple other things. And another wonderful cast member who worked at the Hollywood Five and Dime over at Walt Disney Studios. Turned out she'd actually been here in the States for a year working at Epcot. Ran into several cast members who'd done that. And just very friendly and very nice and very helpful. I mean, even to the point where at Five Guys I was eating dinner and I saw a girl walk in with this incredible coat on. Obviously a cast member, and the coat she's wearing is a special anniversary coat for Disneyland Paris' 25th anniversary. Cast members only. And I'm looking at this coat going, that is the coolest thing, oh my goodness. So I did what could have very easily been perceived as kind of creepy and walked up and said, hey, that's a really cool coat. I used to work at Walt Disney World and I love the coat. Would it be okay if I just took a picture of you in it? Definitely something that could have been perceived as kind of strange. She could have said, look, you're a weird old dude, get away. And no, very friendly, oh sure, absolutely. Here, and poses, and then turns around and poses the other way. Just very nice and accommodating for what could have been a very awkward situation. The closest I came to a rude cast member really wasn't rude, and it wasn't anything I would put on her. She was actually working with a pin trading bulletin board. One of the neatest ways I've seen them set up, because they had all different categories of pins and you trade a like for a like. But while it's there and I'm talking to her, people would repeatedly walk up and they would just start to grab pins. And so she was kind of curtly telling him, hands off, don't touch, leave it alone, talk to me. And I could totally understand how that would be very aggravating and annoying. You know, it's okay to look, but they're really trying to grab pins off of it. So I didn't blame her at all. In fact, with me, because I had talked to her first, she was extremely friendly. I watched her very friendly with other people. It's just the people that wanted to grab, and so I totally didn't blame her for that. It makes me think too that maybe one thing I was doing as well also helped on the friendliness bit, and that was just simply using a few words of French. I read online before I went that one of the things you do is you greet with a bonjour. You walk into a store or a restaurant and you look at the people who are working, you say, bonjour, hello, how are you? Just a simple greeting. And so anytime I ran into a cast member and had a question, I would almost always greet them with a bonjour. I found just doing that and then saying pardon, which is excuse me if you're trying to bump around somebody or they're kind of in the way or you're in the way, which happened several times, or merci, which is thank you. Just using a few French words built this bridge, and especially when they saw the 9-year-old that was in our group try to throw out every French word she could think of. Oh, they loved her speaking French, and they would go out of their way for her because she was trying so hard. Use the language, and hey, people are going to love you and be a whole lot friendlier. Another area that I found a few differences was in the dress code and the way cast members in particular dressed. It was cold most of our trip, and the cast members had on coats, very nice, heavy-duty, warm coats. Down at Walt Disney World, we basically had fleeces, which would work, but we didn't have anything real fancy, partially because it rarely got cold enough for something like that. So their coats and stuff were much better at France than they were in Florida. But the other thing I found too was that several of them were creative with their hair. And you would see some hair coloring in Paris that you would not see be allowed in Florida. Facial hair that was somewhat grown in, but not fully there. Another thing that I saw that surprised me was I saw a couple cast members with tattoos. It actually, in fact, if I hadn't been looking for it, I probably wouldn't have even noticed it. But having been a cast member in Florida, I was a little more aware, I think. It just kind of blended in with the other people around, and so you didn't really see it. It was just kind of the way it was, no big deal. And again, I think it was the ex-Disney cast member eyes that were kind of noticing these things. It was very interesting, even to the point where standards are so different that I actually saw a cast member walking past us in full costume on the phone, and saw a couple other cast members using phones at various points while on stage in front of guests. Out in Florida, that would be an instant termination. Big, huge no-no. It definitely happened a few times while we were there. And of course, some of the outfits I saw some of the guests wear as well. For example, I saw one lady at Walt Disney Studios that was wearing an outfit dressed up as Anna. Full dress, the hair done, and everything. Okay, her shoes didn't quite match. Definitely not an outfit that probably would have been allowed in the States because she was a little old for it. What was really interesting was the same day in the same park, I also saw another adult lady dressed up as Elsa. Wouldn't that have been kind of cool if the two of them had met during the day? And then there was food. This was actually one area that I did run into quite a few differences between Disneyland Paris and Walt Disney World. Walt Disney World, the vast majority of their restaurants, and especially quick services, are open year-round. So you can pretty much always count on almost all the restaurants at Walt Disney World being open. Additionally, the quick service restaurants, their hours were often mirror the hours of the park. And so they may open up an hour or two after the park opens, depending upon what they're serving, but then they're going to be open all the way up to pretty close to closing time. And so if you want a late dinner at, say, 7 or 8 o'clock, you're going to be able to find plenty of places at Walt Disney World or at Disneyland in California to be able to go get a bite to eat. That's not exactly true at Disney Paris. During the off-season, they had a very large number of their restaurants that were just plain closed. And there were actually times that we could walk through a whole land and not see anything that was open. For example, Frontierland has a place called Plaza de Oro. It was closed, and their version of the saloon was closed, and the Cowboy Cookout down the way was closed. So you would run into a lot of places that I never saw open. Toad's Hall never opened. Hakuna Matata never opened. And several of the other places that you hear people talk about having pretty decent food, we never saw the doors open on them at all in the whole time we were there. The ones that were open almost all closed at 6 o'clock if it was a counter service restaurant. If it was a place that required reservations, those would often be open a little bit later. But if you wanted to, say, go grab a burger or a sandwich or something like that, there was a very good chance if it was 7 o'clock that pretty much every place in the park was going to be closed, and you were going to be kind of out of luck at that point. Unless, of course, you walked over to the Disney Village and ate. Even the ones at Walt Disney Studios in the entrance, what they called the Brown Derby, which was really weird, by the way, because Brown Derby at Hollywood Studios in Florida is the single fanciest, most expensive restaurant. And yet the version that was at Walt Disney Studios in Paris was a counter service restaurant, and it closed up at 6, even though the park was open till 9 o'clock. That was just really weird. I didn't get a chance to eat at that one because the 2 times I tried it had already closed. And it was right at the entrance exit of the park. Additionally, the ones that were open, I ate at 4 different counter service restaurants. And the best food of any of them I found was at Casey's with the hot dogs. The burger I had at one was terrible. If you're looking at eating counter service, the McDonald's in Disney Village actually served a much better hamburger than what you found inside the park. It was that bad. We actually ended up eating several of our meals over in Disney Village. I ate at McDonald's a couple times, I ate at Five Guys several times, and Earl of Sandwich, all which had food better than what was in the park, and for the most part, cheaper than what was at the park. So that was one area that was kind of a slight disappointment. There are some of the similarities and differences between Walt Disney World and Disneyland Paris that I noticed while I was there. That's far from the only ones. I was so pleasantly surprised that as an American how open and easy and accessible the park was. Because there's always those fears that, okay, I'm going to another country, and am I going to understand what's happening, and am I going to understand the cast members, and will they understand me? And there was no issues at all there. Honestly, as far as that goes, it was wonderfully open and easy and accommodating and just a lot of fun. It was just occasionally finding that late meal when I was hungry. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little kind of overview look at some of the differences and similarities on my trip. If you are aware of others that I didn't mention, I would love to hear about them. Please don't forget to leave them in the comments below. And hey, maybe if you got some friends or family that are thinking about going to Disneyland Paris, don't forget to share the video with them and hit that like button as well. I also want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting me. There were several things I did on this trip, including using a couple new cameras that were courtesy of them, and I couldn't do stuff like that or produce some of the videos I do without the help of my patrons. If you want to know more about Patreon, don't forget to check the link in the description below. There's also links to my Facebook page, to my Reddit, to the Discord, and other things. You can hear my dog in the background going goofy. I know, she's a goober. Huh, Ginger. I also want to give a huge shout out to my new patrons who signed on in the month of March. A shout out to Tyler Rosenberg, to Matthew Gustafson. I hope I said your name right there, Matthew. To Craig Collai, and to Dan Howlett. Thank you so much for signing on to Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you too to everybody who's watching and enjoying the videos. I so appreciate you. Thanks again, and God bless. One of the things that became very clear on my recent trip to... Oh my gosh. Oops. Forgot the glasses. Those were actually alternating between English and Spanish. Yeah. My friends actually got to go speak They got to go speak Spider-Man. I don't know what that would be. Who worked over at the Five and Dime at Dollywood Studios. Wrong park. Not even the right state or the company. Oh, they loved her speaking French. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right there. If you'd like to see another great video of mine, there's a good one right there for you. And if you'd like to be like these wonderful people and support me on Patreon, hit that link right there. Thanks so much.